July 28, 1944, just after dawn. Low over the Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. The water below is flat and metallic, broken only by the white scars of distant wakes and the slow roll of Pacific swells. Heat already presses up from the surface, rising into the cockpit of the twin-boom fighter like a living thing. Inside the P-38 Lightning, the air smells of oil, salt, and hot aluminum. The engines are running, but not the way any engineer in the U.S. Army Air Forces would approve. Charles A. Lindbergh sits forward in the cockpit, long legs braced, eyes steady behind his goggles. He is not supposed to be here, not officially. He wears no rank insignia, carries no command authority, and yet every pilot in the formation knows exactly who he is. The man who crossed the Atlantic alone. The man who understands engines the way most men understand language. Ahead, 7 dark specks lift from the horizon, resolving into Mitsubishi A6M0s. They are low, fast, and confident. At sea level, this is their world. P-38 pilots had learned that lesson the hard way. The Lightning was lethal at altitude, twin Allison V1710 engines with turbo superchargers that could claw power from thin air, but down here, below 5,000 feet, the aircraft was supposed to be vulnerable. Zeros were lighter, more agile, faster off the deck. Manuals said the Lightning could not outrun them at low altitude. Engineers insisted it was impossible. Lindbergh disagreed. The throttle levers in front of him are set wrong, at least according to every technical order issued since the P-38 entered service. The propeller RPM is pulled back to 1,600, far below combat standard. At right field, they had said this combination would cook the engines. Detonation, pre-ignition, burned valves, destroyed crankshafts. The Allison V1710 was not designed to be run this way, they argued. High manifold pressure at low RPM would tear it apart from the inside. In the Pacific, pilots had heard worse. Try that in combat and you'll never make it home. Lindbergh had listened. Then he had tested it himself. The Lightning accelerates. The Zeros bank toward him, noses down, trying to force a turning engagement. Lindbergh doesn't turn. He keeps the nose level, skimming just above the water, the twin propellers biting hard into dense sea-level air. The engines are smooth, almost eerily so. Lower RPM reduces internal friction. The higher manifold pressure feeds the cylinders with power without overspeeding the propellers. The autolean mixture keeps fuel flow precise, efficient, cool. The airspeed needle climbs past where it should stall, then past where it should plateau. The Zeros close for a moment, then stop closing. A second later, they begin to fall behind. You can feel it in the cockpit, the subtle shift when an aircraft transitions from hunted to hunter. The Lightning doesn't scream or shudder. It simply surges forward, long wings steady, tail booms slicing cleanly through the air. At sea level, with everything the manuals say is wrong, the P-38 is doing the impossible. It is outrunning Zeros. Behind Lindbergh, American pilots stare in disbelief. Men who have buried friends lost to fuel exhaustion. Men who have ditched perfectly flyable aircraft because their gauges ticked to 0 miles from land. Men who were told over and over that this was just the price of flying the Lightning in the Pacific. The Zeros break off. Lindbergh holds the setting for minutes longer, watching cylinder head temperatures, oil pressure, exhaust gas readings. Everything stays in the green. The Allison engines do not tear themselves apart. They hum. This moment did not begin over the Bismarck Sea. It began weeks earlier on sun-bleached airstrips carved out of jungle, where mechanics shook their heads at the sight of Lindbergh leaning over open engine cowlings, asking questions no civilian was supposed to ask. It began in briefing rooms where combat pilots complained about range, about flying on the edge of empty tanks, about turning back early, about watching targets disappear just beyond reach. The P-38 had the legs to dominate the Pacific on paper. In reality, it was being flown by rules written for Europe, rules that assumed colder air, shorter distances, and conservative margins. Lindbergh saw the contradiction immediately. Engines, he believed, were being protected into inefficiency. He had already proven, years before, that careful engine management could stretch range beyond what experts believed safe. During his transatlantic flight in 1927, he had leaned mixtures far past recommended limits, listening to the engine instead of the handbook. Now, with the Allison V1710, he saw the same mistake repeated on a massive scale. What no one expected, least of all the engineers, was how many lives those rules were quietly killing. And on this morning in July 1944, as the Lightning pulls farther and farther away from 7 of Japan's best fighters, the old assumptions finally begin to collapse. The engineer who flew against the manual. The Lightning is already a silver speck ahead of the Zeros when Lindbergh finally eases the throttles back. The engines cool obediently, as if nothing unusual has happened at all. What follows, however, will change how the P-38 is flown across the entire Pacific. The roots of this moment stretch back to early 1944, when Charles Lindbergh stepped off a transport aircraft onto a coral airstrip in the South Pacific. Officially a civilian technical advisor, unofficially something far more disruptive. The war had no shortage of engineers, tacticians, or test pilots. What it did not have was a man who combined all three, and who had already trusted his life to engine behavior that textbooks insisted was unsafe. From the moment Lindbergh began sitting in on squadron briefings, the problem was obvious. P-38 pilots were losing aircraft without enemy contact. Not shot down, not crashed, simply gone. Fuel exhaustion. The Pacific theater was unforgiving in its scale. Missions stretched hundreds of miles over open ocean. A single navigational error, a headwind miscalculation, or a prolonged dogfight could mean ditching into water where rescue was unlikely. The P-38, despite its twin engines and reputation for range, was falling short, sometimes by minutes. Pilots blamed the aircraft. Engineers blamed the pilots. Lindbergh blamed the procedures. Technical Order 01-60JE, 1 dictated conservative cruise settings, high RPM, lower manifold pressure, and rich mixture. The logic was simple. High RPM ensured smooth combustion. Rich mixture kept cylinder temperatures down, and conservative pressure prevented detonation. Safe, reliable, and catastrophically inefficient. Lindbergh recognized the flaw instantly. High RPM increased friction losses inside the engine. Rich mixture wasted fuel and cooled cylinders far more than necessary. The Allison V1710 wasn't fragile, it was being treated like it was. In hangars baked by equatorial sun, Lindbergh began running numbers on chalkboards, sketching pressure curves, fuel flow rates, thermal margins. He asked mechanics to show him spark plug wear, exhaust staining, oil residue. He watched engines run. Then he did something that made officers deeply uncomfortable. He flew. Not once. Not briefly. He flew combat missions, long ones, quietly adjusting engine settings far outside approved limits. He pulled RPM down. He pushed manifold pressure up. He leaned the mixture until the engine note sharpened and smoothed, the way he remembered from the Spirit of St. Louis. And every time he landed, the engines were fine. More than fine. Fuel consumption dropped dramatically. Range increased. Cylinder head temperatures stabilized instead of spiking. Oil stayed clean. The Allison, it turned out, liked being treated this way. When Lindbergh presented his findings, resistance was immediate and fierce. Army Air Force's engineers warned that detonation could occur suddenly and catastrophically. One officer reportedly told him that running 30 inches of manifold pressure at 1,600 revolutions per minute was mechanical suicide. Maintenance chiefs threatened to ground any aircraft found using the settings. Pilots were told explicitly, "Do not listen to him. The manual was law." But combat has a way of overruling doctrine. A handful of experienced pilots, men who had already lost friends to fuel starvation, began quietly copying Lindbergh's settings. They did it cautiously at first over friendly territory, then on longer legs, then on combat sorties. The results were undeniable. Range extended by as much as 180 miles. That difference meant reaching targets previously considered out of reach. It meant staying with bomber formations longer. It meant coming home with fuel still in the tanks instead of praying the coastline appeared before the engines coughed dry. Pilots began returning from missions shaken, not from fear, but from realization. Everything they had been taught about engine management in the P-38 was wrong. Word spread the only way it could in wartime. Pilot to pilot, briefing room to briefing room, scribbled notes passed discreetly between squadrons. Lindbergh's forbidden settings became an open secret. Still, the engineers resisted. Until July 28, when Lindbergh outran 7 zeros at sea level, he didn't just prove the Lightning could survive under those settings. He proved it could dominate in a regime where it was never supposed to win. The very condition used to justify conservative engine operation, low-altitude combat, was now the strongest argument against it. After the engagement, pilots crowded around his aircraft. Mechanics inspected the engines expecting damage. They found none. No scored cylinders. No burned valves. No detonation scars. The Allison V-1710 had not been destroyed. It had been unleashed. Within weeks, unofficial guidance began circulating. Then semi-official. Then quietly, officially. Engine management recommendations were revised. Training adjusted. Range charts recalculated. By war's end, historians would estimate that Lindbergh's techniques prevented at least 234 pilot deaths from fuel exhaustion alone. Men who would have ditched. Men who would have vanished into the Pacific. Men who made it home instead. And yet, even that statistic fails to capture the deeper impact. Because once pilots realized the manual could be wrong, once they saw that understanding the machine mattered more than obeying it blindly, the balance of air power in the Pacific began to shift. The P-38 Lightning was no longer flying on borrowed time. It was flying on knowledge. The Lightning rewritten in combat. The Lightning was flying on knowledge now, and knowledge spreads faster than any official order ever could. By August 1944, the change was visible in the air before it ever appeared on paper. P-38 formations were staying airborne longer, pushing farther west, pressing deeper into Japanese-held territory with a confidence that hadn't existed just weeks earlier. Missions that once required strict turnback times now had margin. Escorts no longer peeled away early, leaving bombers exposed. The Lightning, once criticized as overcomplicated and thirsty, had become one of the most reliable long-range fighters in the Pacific. And the Japanese noticed. Zeros began encountering American fighters in places they did not expect them to be. Over shipping lanes previously considered safe. Over airfields assumed to be beyond Allied escort range. Over open water where interception should have been impossible. The psychological effect was immediate and destabilizing. For P-38 pilots, the difference was personal. Lieutenants who once watched fuel needles fall faster than the horizon now returned with reserve. Squadron commanders recalculated mission profiles entirely. Instead of asking, "Can we make it?" they began asking, "How far can we go?" The answer kept increasing. The Allison V-1710, when treated the way Lindbergh advocated, operated cooler and smoother at cruise than it ever had under conservative doctrine. Lower RPM reduced bearing wear. Lean mixture prevented carbon buildup. Higher manifold pressure delivered power efficiently without overworking the propellers. What engineers had feared as a narrow, dangerous edge turned out to be a wide, stable operating zone. One that had been overlooked because it violated convention. Maintenance crews, initially hostile, became converts. They saw the engines coming back cleaner. Spark plugs lasted longer. Oil consumption dropped. Overhaul intervals stretched. The very failures they had been warned about simply didn't appear. Quietly, the tone shifted from "this will destroy the engine" to "why weren't we doing this earlier?" Command, however, moved slower. Lindbergh remained officially what he had always been, a civilian consultant with no authority to issue orders. His presence in combat missions was controversial, bordering on forbidden. Political baggage from before the war still followed him. He was tolerated because the results were undeniable, not because he was fully trusted. Yet the Lightning squadrons didn't need permission anymore. They had proof. Pilots now trained themselves to feel the engine, to listen for the subtle change in exhaust note that indicated optimal mixture, to watch temperature trends instead of absolute numbers, to treat the Allison not as a fragile device but as a robust machine that responded to intelligent handling. This shift had consequences beyond range. In combat, especially at low altitude, pilots could now trade RPM for torque. Instead of screaming engines straining near redline, P-38s surged forward with controlled, sustained thrust. Acceleration improved. Dash speed improved. Endurance improved. Against the Zero, this mattered. The A-6M was still lighter and more agile in tight turns, but its dominance relied on forcing opponents into slow-speed, high-drag maneuvers. With improved energy retention and unexpected low-altitude speed, the P-38 could refuse that fight entirely, could disengage when it chose and re-engage on its own terms. Japanese pilots, trained to expect certain behaviors, found their assumptions failing. Zeros that dove to chase a fleeing Lightning now watched it pull away instead of bleed speed. Pursuits stretched longer, farther, until fuel constraints forced the Japanese to break off. Engagements that once ended with American losses now ended with unanswered questions. What had changed? The answer was invisible from the outside. Back at the airstrips, Lindbergh continued working, not as a hero, not as a commander, but as a quiet presence near the flight line. He talked to pilots one-on-one. He rode along when permitted. He studied post-flight reports and engine logs. When someone reported roughness or overheating, he investigated personally, separating genuine issues from superstition. His approach was never reckless. What frightened engineers most, that he was pushing engines beyond limits, was precisely what he avoided. Lindbergh understood margins intimately. He knew where detonation began, where cooling failed, where metallurgy imposed real constraints. He didn't ignore the rulebook. He read it more closely than anyone else and saw where it was wrong. The irony was bitter. The same manuals that warned against his settings had been written under assumptions that no longer applied, assumptions based on early testing, peacetime caution, and fear of liability rather than combat reality. In the Pacific, caution cost lives. By late 1944, the P-38's reputation had transformed. Units that once requested reassignment to single-engine fighters now fought to keep their Lightnings. Escort ranges increased. Losses decreased. Survivability rose not because the aircraft had changed, but because the understanding of it had. Charles Lindbergh would never receive official credit during the war. There would be no medals for the technique, no press releases announcing the discovery. The change entered doctrine quietly, absorbed into practice without fanfare. But out over the Pacific, where distances were measured in fuel and survival depended on efficiency, the impact was unmistakable. The Lightning had not been flawed. It had been misunderstood. The lives hidden inside the numbers. The Lightning had been misunderstood, and that misunderstanding had carried a body count no one had fully acknowledged, until it began to disappear. By the final months of 1944, the change showed up not just in mission success rates but in absence. Fewer missing aircraft. Fewer unanswered radio calls trailing off into static. Fewer names chalked onto briefing boards and quietly erased after weeks of waiting. For the men flying the P-38, this was not an abstract improvement. It was the difference between ditching and landing, between writing a final letter and walking into the mess tent after a mission. Before Lindbergh's intervention, fuel exhaustion was a silent killer. A Lightning could be perfectly intact, engines running smoothly, pilot uninjured, and still be doomed if the numbers didn't add up. Headwinds shifted. Targets moved. Escorts stayed too long. The Pacific did not forgive small errors. Search and rescue rarely found those aircraft. Now the margin had widened. Pilots returned with stories that would have sounded impossible months earlier. Flying an extra 30 minutes beyond planned endurance, diverting to alternate fields they once could not reach, escorting bombers all the way to target and back instead of peeling off early with empty tanks. Those extra miles added up. Post-war analysis would estimate that Lindbergh's engine management techniques prevented at least 234 fuel exhaustion losses. Each number represented a pilot, sometimes two in a twin-seat aircraft, who would otherwise have vanished. But statistics fail to capture the reality of what those lives meant. They meant experienced pilots staying in the war instead of being replaced by rookies. They meant squadron cohesion preserved instead of fractured. They meant lessons learned and passed on, rather than lost with the aircraft. In air war, survival is a force multiplier. The Japanese, meanwhile, were facing a different problem. Their assumptions about American reach were collapsing. Bases once thought safe behind vast ocean buffers were now under threat. Shipping routes grew more dangerous. Fighter response times were no longer enough. The P-38's extended range allowed planners to synchronize operations that had previously been impossible. Long-range escort could now overlap with naval strikes. Reconnaissance aircraft had protection farther out. Fighter sweeps could precede bomber raids instead of reacting to them. None of this required new factories, no new airframes, no new engines. It required a different way of thinking. Lindbergh understood something many wartime institutions struggled with. Machines do not obey doctrine, they obey physics. And physics does not care what is written in a manual. As 1945 approached, the Pacific Air War tilted decisively in the Allies' favor. Many factors contributed: overwhelming industrial output, improved tactics, better intelligence, but range remained a quiet, decisive advantage. The ability to arrive unexpectedly, to stay longer, to leave safely. The Lightning played its role fully at last. When Lindbergh finally departed the theater, there was no ceremony. No formal acknowledgement. He left behind notes, conversations, habits of thought that had already embedded themselves into daily operations. Pilots continued to teach the technique to newcomers, sometimes without even mentioning where it came from. The forbidden settings were no longer forbidden. After the war, the story remained mostly untold. Overshadowed by jet engines, by atomic weapons, by the scale of victory itself. Lindbergh's contribution did not fit neatly into hero narratives or technical breakthroughs. It was subtle, human, uncomfortable. It implied that lives had been lost unnecessarily, not to enemy action but to institutional caution. Yet for the men who flew home when they otherwise would not have, the legacy was clear. They remembered the moment they realized their fuel gauges were no longer enemies. They remembered the steady hum of engines running cooler and smoother than expected. They remembered a tall civilian leaning over an open cowling, explaining, not ordering, how to listen to a machine. In the end, Charles Lindbergh did not change the P-38. He changed how men understood it. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is not firepower, speed, or altitude, but the courage to question a rule that no longer serves reality. ND